Ecology video lecture on sexual selection and intercompetition. So, what is sexual selection and intercompetition? Intercompetition is the competition between two species to find mates in order to reproduce, whereas sexual selection is the process of selecting a mate, and this is typically carried out by a female. Now, when we think of intercompetition, what are the types of competition that come to mind? Although we might directly associate intercompetition between species with direct combative competition, this does occur, but is not frequently the case. Intercompetition is mostly associated with traits that provide a species with a greater chance of outcompeting a rival organism for the chance of mating. So where did the ideas of intercompetition and sexual selection originate? Well, like much of the ideas of natural selection, they can be attributed to Charles Darwin, who noticed sexual selection and intercompetition occurring in the Galapagos when he was studying speciation. So which traits can be associated with having a higher reproductive success? A variety of traits can be associated with a reproductive advantage. These traits may directly attract mates or improve the chance of fertilization during copulation. Traits which aid in attracting mates can be broken down into morphological, physiological, or behavioral traits. When we think of sexual selection advantageous traits, those that are morphological are fairly obvious and can include coloration, size, weapons, as well as sexual organs. Behavioral traits are also fairly obvious as we see courtship dances and hear songs. And then there's the less obvious physiological traits which also exist, and they can include endurance. Now, understanding that there are certain traits that correlate with a sexual selection advantage, where does the female choice originate? As to say, why do traits, whether it be physical, behavioral, or physiological, correlate with female choice? Well, according to the good gene hypothesis, certain traits are associated with higher reproductive rates and a greater chance of offspring survival. Females then choose mates who have a better chance of providing fertile, viable offspring. Now, how does natural selection relate to sexual selection? Well, organisms that survive are those that have the greatest chance of passing their genes on to the next generation. But they also must not be impacted by the environmental constraints they face. As to say, natural selection will favor organisms which are able to be sexually selected for, but also able to survive. Because traits must work to produce an advantage of sexual selection, while not being a liability to natural selection, traits that are associated with natural and sexual selection form a compromise. Traits are cost-benefit, meaning traits will persist if the reproductive advantage outweighs the survival negativity they may present. Now, let's look at an example of a clash between sexual selection and survival in the male genus Encinias. The Encinias is basically a small brown mouse, and it has a less obvious, advantageous physiological advantage of having very high endurance. Now, this allows the mouse to be able to spend more time at the breeding site. Thus, it will be sexually selected for by females, as it would increase the chances of producing offspring. Now, what is the problem with this? Well, the genus experiences a clash between sexual selection traits and natural selection because its endurance is so high that it impacts its survival. The Encinias will not leave the breeding site to obtain its essentials such as food and water, and eventually they will begin to die off. Natural selection will then form a compromise with sexual selection, resulting in less endurance, but it will not completely disappear. Birds provide a lot of examples of sexual selection. Birds are one of the easiest species to observe sexual selection in because of their behavioral and morphological traits. Here we see a species that I think a lot of us are probably familiar with, the bluefoot booby. As we've seen from the picture, the bluefoot booby has very bright coloration of its feet. The more blue the feet are, the greater the chance the female will sexually select the male, allowing for a greater chance of passing genes. To show off their feet, the bluefoot booby male goes through a courtship dance, showing off a behavioral trait leading to greater sexual selection. And since this has not impacted their survival, no natural selection has been put into place to modify these traits. Now let's look at direct intercompetition that is relating to physical traits. Bighorn rams are one of the few species that actually compete in direct ways in order to find a mate. Social rank is decided through age and by times competition. The most superior male is decided through age, mass, and competition, has the greatest chance of being selected by the female. Now, is there anything about this process that hinders the survival of the bighorn ram? Well, in this case, their weapons, which are their horns, lead to being selected for sexually, and this trait also helps them survive. However, battles themselves result in injuries between the species, which can lead to vulnerability and later death. To compromise for this, direct competition is limited, and often social rank is predetermined based on age and mass. Thank you for watching my video lecture. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something.